All right. Yep. Hey everyone. So we are live. So we have a couple of questions that have come in. We're going to go through and do a formal introduction here soon. But if you guys have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat as well. And Jeff and I will be monitoring those. So if you see us kind of looking away, it's because we're looking at phones and screens, and in order to see your questions as they come in. So okay, well we hit the 6:30 mark. So welcome. We are officially celebrating our 16th straight week of doing these events. And so we decided to kind of change it up a little bit this week, and we brought in some extra people. So on your screen, you're going to see four different people. We're going to start from the top left. That's going to be Matt Reilly. Matt is a pretty phenomenal guide in our Virginia region. He is really knowledgeable in fishing for smallmouth, brook trout, regular trout, musky. He's definitely our resident musky expert on our panel, and he's kind of fished all over the state as well as elsewhere. Also is incredibly knowledgeable on fly tying in general, especially a lot of the Virginia-specific patterns as developed by Chuck Kraft. And like Jeff, has kind of been a little bit involved in some testing out some rods and things like that. So if you have any questions about really any of those types of topics, he's a great resource. On our top right, you have myself. I know a little bit about fishing, just enough to be dangerous, but I specialize in doing the warm water game fish, bass, smallmouth, lake fishing. I kind of dabble in a little bit of everything. So I'll answer as best as I can, but I might leave it up to our experts more. On our lower left, we're going to have Andy Slawson. Andy is with Mossy Creek Fly Fishing. Knows a ton about different gear, but is also a phenomenal fly tyer, and he was a guest the other week. If you remember, he tied a Buford fly, big musky pattern, but a pattern that you can also scale down for other species as well. And like everyone else, has really fished the Virginia region hard. Has fished saltwater, freshwater, all the way up to our mountain streams. So again, great resource and a lot of knowledge within the industry. And last but not least, on our bottom right, we have Jeff Greendyke. He helps me out an awful lot with, doing our live streams. He's usually on every other week. So, he's, again, a lot of skill around the fly tying and fly fishing. He's been involved in some rod design with company. And, he also at one point was on a pro team for fly fishing off kayaks. So if you have any questions about kayak fishing, he's a great resource for that as well. So we've got, I think a pretty good panel from kind of across the different parts of fly fishing that you're going to run across in the Virginia region. For any of us, any people joining from outside of Virginia, we'll do our best to kind of answer any questions that you may have specific to your region. A lot of stuff in Virginia can work, either down south if you're saltwater fishing, or the mountain streams out in the Colorados and in those regions. So if you have any questions there, we'll do our best, but we're not going to claim to be experts for those areas. So thank you guys for joining. And for the very first question, I think we're going to kind of kick it off with where to fish, right? And again, these questions can be anything about fly fishing related. And I think the one that all of us are thinking about is, hey, a lot of places now have opened up a little bit. We still need to be really careful, but, are there ways that I can go out and safely fly fish? And if so, what should I be fishing for? And what should I avoid, right? There are a couple fisheries now that are, certain parts of water is kind of should be considered as closed off just for the safety of fish. So, I don't know if one of you guys want to jump right in there and kind of answer what you think you should be fishing for now and easy ways for people to go out and fish in a safe manner.
I mean, I guess I'll start wherever there's water. It's for me, I'm a warm water guy, so I would say go fishing for smallmouth or largemouth. But talking to Andy a little bit earlier, it sounds like brook trout are still something that's viable. So that sounds pretty cool to me. But yeah, for me, it's wherever there's water.
So Andy, you were saying that brook trout fishing is still viable. What do we mean by that? What do we mean by viable? What should people be really worried about, and how can they figure out whether or not it's safe for brook trout fishing? And when we talk about brook trout fishing, we're really talking about going up into our mountain streams, whether that be in Shenandoah or whether that be into like a George Washington National Forest. And Matt, I want to say that you do some brook trout fishing almost year round because you know a couple places that it can be safe. So what do you guys, Matt and Andy, look for to know whether or not you can go after brook trout, and why are we worried about time of year for fishing for those fish?
Well, so the main stuff that I'm watching for is going to be water flow and water temperature. So I was out today, and I know that we've had plenty of rain here, at least in the Harrisonburg area. So our streams are still full. They're still cold. There's lots of oxygen running through them. So there's plenty of habitable water for trout where we can catch them without putting them at risk. So going out through the summer, keep an eye on water flows. If they start to get low, they're going to heat up pretty quick. There's not going to be a whole lot of oxygen readily available for the trout. So we don't need to stress them anymore by continuing to fish for them. But, on a year like this where we've had pretty consistent rain, if the smallmouth rivers and stuff are flooded, as long as it's staying cool up in the mountains, you can get out there and do it. But you can always call and, check with a fly shop or somewhere where people are getting out a lot and see what conditions are before you go.
Yeah, and then Matt, what do you really look for with regards to brook trout? Pretty similar?
Yeah. So I'd say I don't do a ton of brook trout fishing down this way just because they are not quite as plentiful as back home in the Shenandoah region. But what we have down here is a huge population of wild trout, so wild rainbows and brown trout. And a lot of our streams start and run through higher elevations than you'll find back in that area. So like my house is at 2,000 feet right here, which is about the elevation you'd be fishing at on most of the brook trout streams in Shenandoah National Park, unless you're way up at the top. And so a lot of our trout streams here start up at 4,500 feet, 3,500 feet, and they stay pretty cold year round. And so, we can fish year round down here, and mainly because we have pretty consistent flow. And even if we don't have, average to high flow summer, we have cool water. We've got springs all over the place, and the water's generally, even in July, you're going to find 60 to 65 degree water temps. That's plenty safe. So that's what I look for mainly is water temp. And then when things do get really, really low, if we have a dry year like we had sort of the end of last summer, even if the water's cold enough, the fishing just gets real tough, and I would rather default to smallmouth fishing because that's sort of my preferred quarry in the summertime. But yeah, I mean, I mainly am just looking for cold water, and we've got plenty of that around here, so that's not a problem for us.
Yeah, for myself, I mean, the way that my fishing year, I mean, we're very fortunate in Virginia. We can fish year round. And, not everywhere kind of has that luxury, especially for fly fishing. So, my fishing year, I like to say, starts around November, somewhere around mid-November, end of November, waiting for the brook trout to finish spawning. then I'll go up, and that's when I actually start targeting them. And I'll fish for brook trout in those winter months, and then I'll also fish for musky. And we've got a musky question or two for you, Matt, here that we'll go on to next. Once we get to the spring time frame, that's when it gets really hard in our region to figure out what to fish for, because everything's on, right? Our brook trout, they're really starting to get active on dry flies. But then our lakes are starting to get fired up, and that's when you can go after some big largemouth. But the river systems too, right? They start getting more active, where the smallmouth, big smallmouth start coming out. But right around the May timeframe for me is typically when, at least in our region, especially around Charlottesville, where we're based out of. And Matt, I know you're a little bit farther south down you're Roanoke area, right?
I'm a few hours south of Roanoke.
So yeah, even farther south, yeah. So obviously your fishing season will be different by a few weeks than ours. But I switch over primarily to just targeting smallmouth in the summer, because it's a safe fishery and it's a lot of fun. Again, looking at water levels, kind of attacking on another question that we had. Someone was asking, where is it best to fish? Is it best to fish at a lake versus small river? So for myself, when I started fly fishing, I started in the lakes, and a lot of that had to do with confidence. So, all of my fishing prior had been in lakes, going out and targeting, largemouth bass and panfish species, and even northern pike up in the waters up in Maryland. And, I translated that down to fly fishing. One of the nice things about learning to fish in still water is you don't have that element of your fly drifting, right? So, just going out with a small popper on the surface and casting it out to bluegill, you get that benefit of, being able to learn to do your cast, but also visually seeing when a fish has hit your fly. So for me, I always think personally, it's best to learn on a lake, do some pan fishing, especially this time of year, and then move over into the rivers where things can get a little bit more complicated with moving water. But if you have experience on river systems more than lakes, start with what you know and fish that. In our Charlottesville area, again, we're pretty spoiled here. We've got the Shenandoah River system, which typically you need a boat to fish, but is an incredible fishery for smallmouth. But over here in Charlottesville, we've got the Rivanna, and the couple of parks are open with access, and you can go and wade fish the Rivanna right now, and absolutely go after smallmouth. In fact, barring any rain, this weekend will be a great weekend for it, because the water levels are really safe for wade fishing. So I do want to move on to the question we had around musky. So Matt, specifically, for you, and then, I think the rest of us can kind of chime in for general toothy predators. When you're fly fishing for musky, obviously musky have a very sharp set of teeth in their mouth. What type of line leader are you using to help prevent breakage? And are you worried about using, wire versus other types? Have you ever noticed that fish shy away from?
Yeah, so I do use wire. I don't. Musky are not a fish that you want to go and get. I don't have much tolerance for losing musky. If I lose a fish, I'm going to do something to mitigate that. But my primary setup for leaders is, first of all the fly lines that I fish have welded loops on the ends of them. So I build a 3-foot section of about 30-pound fluorocarbon, and I use, currently I've been using the Seagar Blue Label stuff. It's a just good hard fluorocarbon, and then I'll put a perfection loop in the butt end of it, so I can loop it to my fly line. And then I use anywhere from 25 to 40 pound knottable wire as a bite guard, and those are connected with an Albright knot, which is pretty easy knot to learn. And I use about I use about 12 to 18 inches of wire. I've never had any issue with fish chomping on the fluorocarbon part of the leader. The reason why you should use a lighter leader than you might think. I mean, there's 45, 50-pound muskie swimming around in some of our rivers, and you may catch one like that. I mean, that'd be a state record class fish, but most fly lines break their core strength's about 30 pounds. 35 once you put the PVC coating, the tungsten, you're fishing a sinking line, it's got a tungsten and PVC coating. And so you want to have some sort of break built into your leader. So if you somehow are able to put 30 pounds of dead pressure on a fish, your fly line's not the thing that breaks, it's your leader. That I've never had that happen. But yeah, so 30 pounds of fluorocarbon to about 12 to 18 inches of wire. And those lengths are important to me because when you're musky fishing, you retrieve your fly to the boat every single time. And I prefer to have about a third of my rod in the water, so angled straight down into the water from the boat, with about 3 feet of rod in the water. And sometimes you've got great water clarity and you can see your fly coming all the way back to the boat. Sometimes you don't. And so having that knot right at 18 inches or so allows you to hear where your fly is relative to your rod tip. So if you're stripping, you just hear your fly line coming through your guides, and then you hear a click, and that's your perfection loop coming through your rod tip. And then you do, generally it's like 2 more strips, you might hear another click. And then you're about 18 inches, from your fly. You do another strip, you'll be tight to your fly. But when you go into a figure 8 motion with the fly rod, I prefer to have about 18 inches out of my rod tip. So if I can hear where those knots are and I have a consistent distance between that fluorocarbon to wire knot and my fly, then I can hear exactly where my fly is, and I don't have to guess if there's any stain to the water and I can't see down 3 feet. And then I typically use small snap swivels for at the end of my wire bite tippet, and that's just connected with a loop knob. And all swivels are not created equal. I've been through 4 or 5 different kinds, and because some of them just open. I've had people cast flies into trees, and just the impact of the swivel hitting a tree branch pops the swivel open, and that's good. So the ones that I've settled on are made by the American Fishing Wire Company, and they're the version is the 70-pound version, and that is just speaking of the strength of the wire. The strength of the wire has nothing to do with how difficult they are to open. But that one I found is pretty dang stiff, and it takes a little bit of work to get it open. And I've never had one open or fail on me. So that's how I tend to roll.
Yeah, no, that's a great piece of advice. Andy will actually attest. He was in the boat with me when, I had actually got a musky, one of the very few to actually eat. And all I brought back was an open swivel with some teeth marks on it.
Well, to the point, I mean, I was telling you the story about I had this guy, he was a friend of mine, thankfully it wasn't anybody that was paying me, but I had run out of my standby swivel, and all I could find at the local store here, I'd ordered some more online, but they weren't here yet. All I could find were these swivels I thought were similar, and he cast one into a tree, and halfway back to the boat, his fly just wiggled off of his swivel. Lost the fly, and all we had was an empty swivel. And, never again are we going to do. I cut them all off at that point and just tied knots because, it's not, like I said, it's not worth losing a fish. Right. And you were talking about, stealth and wire and that kind of thing. Some people do, and I have used heavy, hard mono, 80 to 100 pound plus mono as a bite tippet. And that works, but I know a lot of people who now use wire because they say they were tired of losing musky. And again, I don't ever want to be tired of losing musky. I just don't want to lose it. So that's why I don't really mess with that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. When you send out to other species of fish, this is where I've got more experience with using wire versus using, a fluoro or a hard mono. There are some species that their lateral lines are sensitive enough that they will pick up that additional metal, and it might cause them to move away. And the story that I always tell with that is I was fishing down up in Ocean City, but this could be pertinent to or Virginia Beach and a lot of our coastal waters here. And we had at that time there were some very large bluefish that have moved in. Specifically, they were 30 some inches plus. And I remember watching a pair of bluefish come up, and I'd been fishing wire because the previous day I was targeting stripers, and so I didn't have on a hard mono leader, I didn't have on hard fluoro or any wire, because you usually can get away with that with striper, and I had gotten bitten off by a 30 plus inch bluefish. So I'd put on the wire, and to watch those fish from the day before where no hesitation come up and slam it, to where they would come in mouth open but then stop and circle the fly twice and then swim off. That was a species that was leader shy, could actually sense that wire. So depending on what you're targeting for musky, as Matt was telling us, it's not as big of a deal. That's a fish that the wire will not bother them, and that makes sense, right? They're the biggest, baddest predator in the river system. There's not much that they're going to fear. But as you move into salt water, that might you might have a species that's a little bit more shy.
Yeah, muskie are very much a species that, well, first of all, your ideal conditions are not super clear water. So, theoretically, in that situation, your wire is not going to show up as well as it would in October if the water's pretty low and clear. But, hopefully, if you've done your job, you've got the fish engaged to a point where he's paying attention to nothing but the fly. And to that point, I've had muskie literally in a figure eight leave the fly and try to take a bite out of my oar blade, which is of course attached to like 1 5/8 of fiberglass oar shaft. So if they'll do that, I don't think wire's really going to get in their way. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And that kind of leads us into our next question. So we had someone ask us, what kind of movement for flies work best, and how can you get that movement? And obviously that's a pretty broad question. So with musky, you were talking about figure eight, so we might kind of go into that, and then maybe open it up to the rest of us who aren't quite as experienced in musky, but with smallmouth bass and maybe even for trout, about movement of flies that you see work really well, and then whether or not that pertains to topwater poppers, whether or not to subsurface. I know that's something that I struggled with a lot when I came over to fly fishing, because it didn't translate perfectly, from your traditional spin rods. It was something that was very different. You kind of had to retrain how you're going to make that fly look alive, and whether or not you're going to do that through the rod tip, or whether or not you're going to do that purely from stripping the line.
Yeah, I mean, with lure movement or fly movement, fly is a lure. It depends. And smallmouth, I'll take smallmouth as my example. What they want one day might be different from what they want the next one. Matt and I had a trip last summer, and truly one day to the next, what they wanted was completely different. So, what's the best movement? The one that catches fish. But the smallmouth, it could be they want a dead drifted fly, or they want a fly that's actually ripped. And when we talk about ripping a fly, I'm talking, 18, 20 inches worth of strip of the fly. with each movement. You know, I call it when I'm shad fishing, I call it, you know, the monkey on crack is about how you should be stripping. So really, you know, the best movement out there is the one that matches the fly. If you're fishing a topwater bug, you know, if you're fishing a dry fly, most likely it's dead drifted. Maybe a little bit of, you know, shake, because you think about it, you're imitating, you know, an insect on the water. They don't sit totally still, but they don't try moving through the water quickly. So, you know, bait fish can move at different speeds. Crayfish, you kind of want to hop them, as I learned from Matt a couple years ago. Chuck Kraft always told me to hop them, and I, you know, yeah, sure, Chuck, you know what you're doing. And then Matt proved it to me one day, and yeah. So, and then, you know, I've watched Andy do some things with flies where I wasn't planning on that ever working, you know, and then going like, nah, that won't work, and, you know, he'll dead drift something that I would be stripping quickly. So.
Yeah, Andy, what kind of advice do you have with you know, kind of fly retrieval, and, you know, is it just well, we'll just go through a particular cycle of movements until I find what's working, or do you have kind of go-tos and then you'll deviate off of that if it's not working that day?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll talk about it in terms of trout fishing. You know what I know more, and I'll leave the smallmouth to Matt. But when I put on a streamer and I'm trout fishing, typically, you know, one of my first go-tos is going to be, you know, just fishing a swing, you know, just swinging the fly. So I'll cast perpendicular across the river, and basically I'll just let that fly swing to the end, and then once it gets there, I'll strip it back. And, you know, my feeling with throwing streamers is that if a fish is going to eat it, typically they're going to do it, you know, pretty quick. They're not going to see that fly go by a couple times before they're going to eat it. So if I don't have something happening relatively quickly, I'll change up my retrieve. You know, you can catch fish on streamers so many different ways. A lot of people think of just fishing downstream, but I mean, there's times where you'll want to actually cast upriver and, you know, almost like Jeff was saying, hop it back. Other times you want to have it swimming across the current. So really it's hard to say exactly what to do, but change it up, you know, as you go and figure the fish out. Like Jeff said, they can change day to day. Weather is going to change how they act. You know, when it's freezing cold out, those fish typically aren't going to want to sprint across the river and eat your fly. You know, a lot of the times they want a slower presentation then, versus, you know, more ideal trout conditions, say the water's 60 degrees or 58 degrees, they're going to be pretty active and maybe a little bit more willing to go on almost a hunt for the fly. So, yeah, long story short, change it up. Find something you catch fish on a lot and start with that. And if it doesn't work, don't be afraid to change.
Yeah, I'll vary my retrieve too based upon the actual conditions. And so, you know, if I'm fishing a lake and, you know, going after, you know, largemouth bass, you know, especially later on in the year when I know, okay, I'll have small bass hanging out right up next to the shoreline, but my larger bass, you know, they're going to be wading down, you know, off points and a little bit farther down that water column. You know, I may be casting out where I'm waiting to let that fly sink. You know, especially if I'm fishing one that has like a neutral buoyancy, like a deceiver or something like that. I'm really waiting on my retrieve until I know, okay, from experience, that fly is now down at a certain water column. And then I may give a couple extra twitches or strips to make it suddenly move and then really suspend again, to just make it look like that dying bait fish that's slowly sinking to the bottom. With moving water, you know, and this, I found this really effective again with smallmouth. You know, if my water is really high, then I'm not going to try a traditional streamer retrieve, because that water is going to be so much swifter than those fish are used to, and it's going to keep my fly up at a higher level. So I'm going to be casting more upstream and really trying to dead drift, have that fly act like, you know, something that swept down current, and try to get that fly where it's going to get down towards the bottom where those fish are going to be holding, where there's less energy involved. But when, you know, it's like it is right now, and hopefully this weekend, where those water levels are far more normal for this time of year, I'm going to be casting maybe a quarter up or directly across the current, and having that fly as I strip it in, you know, strip, pause, strip, pause, and kind of let it work its way across that river system, where, you know, it's, you know, darting and then stopping and darting and stopping, and that can really trigger a response. And then, Matt, I know that you fish some very specific flies for smallmouth, which, you know, whether it be the clawdad or whether it be, you know, the popping bug or even the CK baitfish. I mean, each of those kind of have their own unique movement. So I think part of it too is there's particular go-tos for general streamers, and then there are specific flies that are even better for very specific types of techniques. And so, you know, I kind of want to talk about the clawdad and how you fish that fly. And I know that was our first fly that we actually tied when we went to our live stream format. And so it'd be kind of good to kind of get your opinion on the most effective ways to fish those, and whether or not those can be effective to fish weight fishing, or if there's something you really need to fish from a boat, and ways that you may approach water with it.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the water, you know, for one. I mean, if you have a river with small pieces of pocket water, you know, and fish sort of holding in those pockets, eating food coming downstream to them fairly mechanically, you know, you can essentially treat a clawdad as a nymph. You know, you can dead drift the thing in front of the fish, and they're used to seeing the occasional crayfish come by, and they can eat it or not. And that's a lot more passive of a fishing technique, because you're trying to appeal to a fish that's in a routine feeding mood. You know, he sees a crayfish, he's going to eat it opportunistically, but he's already feeding. Versus, you know, fishing a streamer aggressively. Most of the time, if you fish a streamer aggressively, you're going to elicit an aggressive sort of reactionary response, a feeding response. But then, you know, again, that fishing it in pocket water is probably best done foot. If you're, you know, smallmouth fishing in early April and you have cold water and in a big river, you know, it's probably best done from a boat, just because the fish are not going to be in super predictable, super tight places, and you can cover a lot of water that way. But how you retrieve a fly depends greatly upon the fish, for one, and then what you're trying to imitate. And then, like Andy said, is, you know, it's kind of simple, but it's genius at the same time. You know, just the conditions. You know, so if you're fishing a clawdad at the end of March, you've got, you know, maybe 50-degree water temps. The smallmouth are still pretty slow. You know, they're not, their bodies have not gone through the chemical metabolic process of being able to move all that fast and chase food down, and so they're going to eat a lot slower. You got to get down in front of their face, and you need to fish a lot slower. And so fishing something really slow on the bottom is usually the ticket, and that's why a lot of people fish heavy crayfish flies in the late or early springtime frame. Speaking on bass in particular, once there's usually a switch around the mid 50s or so in terms of water temp, where it's now metabolically worth it for them to chase something. You know, they can move fast enough to catch something, and but the water's not so warm that by chasing something down, they're losing energy, in the process of doing so. And so fishing, that's why a lot of people, when it comes to smallmouth fishing, you start the season off early, fishing slow and deep and on the bottom. And once you get further into the springtime, you start fishing a little higher up in the water column, and bait fish imitations and stuff like that. And then relevant to the musky question, or the musky side of things, certain fish have certain triggers and ways they like to eat food, and it's been scientifically proven several times, and it's just something that people see fishing for them is just the way that they're built, with a long sort of flat mouth and rows of teeth, and they have sort of rapid closing speed. They're not really fast fish. They're not going to make long runs. They don't sprint up and down the river, but they can close distances really quickly. And so their preferred way to eat food is to aim for center mass and to sort of just quickly strike and eat the fly or a bait fish or something like that. And so most musky flies are designed to present a side profile, which is also the reason why you end up doing a figure eight every retrieve. Because in my mind, if you get a fish to follow to the boat and he hasn't yet, it's either because he doesn't really care about eating it and he's just trying to escort it out of his territory, or he hasn't seen that preferred angle, his preferred striking angle yet. He hasn't had that opportunity to eat the fly the way that's most efficient for him yet. And so by doing a figure eight, you show them multiple angles of the fly and ideally trigger a fish into eating something. But as Jeff said, you're not going to fish an elk ear caddis that way, because elk ear caddis aren't fish and they don't swim. So how you retrieve or present a fly is always going to have to do with how the thing you're imitating moves, how a fish prefers to eat that thing, and then what the conditions are that are sort of ruling the fish's world.
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, it's a complicated question to tackle, and one that I think we all chase all our lives to figure out. But no, I think that's very helpful. So we talked a little bit. We've been talking a lot about smallmouth, and there's specific reasons for it. I mean, right now, especially in our region around Charlottesville, it's just a fish that if you haven't targeted, you should give it a try. So we actually just got a question in around it. When fishing for smallmouth or panfish, what do you use first? And so the way I'm going to interpret that question, and I apologize if I interpret it incorrectly, in your day of fishing for smallmouth, what are you going to put on your rod first in the morning? Does it matter? And then as that day goes on and the sun changes and temperatures change, what does that also impact your fly selection? And so I don't know if that matters as much for the panfish side. So I'll answer that part, and then I'll defer to everyone else for smallmouth. Panfish, bless their heart, will hit almost anything at almost any time. It's one of the reasons why I love them. It's one of the reasons why I usually, if I'm fishing on a lake, I have a rod set up for panfish. That no matter what, if I'm going after some bigger bass and, been striking out, I'll pick up that rod, and I'll usually have a little popper on it because they almost always hit topwater. I've caught panfish on topwater in the middle of winter. and I'll throw that out underneath of a tree or cover where I know that they are, and let them hit. But for smallmouth, I think that's something that does change throughout the day as far as what might be the preferred fly to use. Well, Matt's on the move. Jeff, Andy, what were your thoughts around there? What are your strategies for targeting smallmouth?
I'll let Andy go first on this one.
Well, I mean, again, it's kind of like, how do you retrieve the fly? It's very dependent upon the time of year, and also where you're fishing. I think you're best if you're fishing often enough where you can kind of play a trial and error game, and then after maybe a couple days of doing it, what those fish are eating, or you have a good idea, so you've got a good starting point. If I'm going out and I think that there's a chance that I can get fish to eat on the surface, a lot of the times I might, as they say, go down with the ship, and I'll sit there with a topwater bug for hours, without getting an eat, just because I like surface fishing, whether that be dry flies for trout or poppers for bass, anything like that. But, it's hard to say, but you can always check with people who are on the river a lot. They're going to have a good idea for that time of year. I'd say probably your best bet if you're starting this time of year would be start with a bait fish pattern or something. But it's going to change throughout the year, and it's going to change sometimes on a day-to-day basis. But go out with what you're confident in, and then go from there.
Yeah, and Jeff, do you kind of do a similar strategy, or?
I do a similar strategy, but I'm kind of backwards to Andy. I will go down with the ship when it comes to bait fish patterns. I love fishing bait fish flies, especially light colored ones that don't sink very much. I like actively fishing. I like getting that aggressive strike, and anytime I can fish a bait fish pattern that's light colored near the surface, I'm getting to actively fish a fly, see it, and most of the time I get to actually see the strike. So that's sort of the ship that I will go down with, generally.
Yeah.
Nothing is better than taking a CK bait fish, stripping it 3-4 feet off the bank, and all of a sudden the fly disappears. Because if the fly disappears, it's going to be at least a good fish. If it shoots 2 feet to the side, you're like, okay, it could be a good fish. It could be, a small fish. If it totally disappears and never shows back up again, that it was a huge fish. So that's, kind of the ship that I like to go down with. Not saying I don't like to fish up on top, because the strike is always awesome. But I generally, this time of year, I'm going to go towards a light colored bait fish pattern, even a white woolly bugger. I want something light colored. If I can fish it, if we have dark water, okay, fine, I'll fish a dark fly. But most of the time, it's going to be a light colored fly up near the surface.
Yeah. That's fun. So for me, typically when I target smallmouth, my preference, because a lot of times I'm wade fishing, is I want to be in a relatively shallow, not swift-moving creek or river system, right? You think the Rivanna in Charlottesville, and of course, I grew up in Maryland, so we had a couple of specific river systems up there, and what I would do is I would follow the sun. This is a little bit later in the year when our water temperatures go up a bit, and the bass will hit surface. But when you think about smallmouth and even largemouth, they do have to be aware of predators in whether it be raptors, hawks. We don't get too many ospreys as far inland, but same can be true for ospreys if you're closer to the ocean, and eagles as well. As that sun rises, the sunlight can penetrate that water column more. And that means that those fish are more vulnerable if they're hanging out by the surface. And so oftentimes, they're going to be moving into shaded water or deeper water to kind of avoid, those airborne predators. So if I'm out and I know I'm going to be fishing all day, I'll start with a popper and work that because, I love the topwater bite. I love seeing that explosion on the surface. And that's, those lower light conditions is when I find topwater to be more effective. And then as it gets warmer in the day, as the sun gets higher, I'll switch over to streamers and start fishing midwater to bottom water columns and find a lot of success there. And then as the sun starts going back down at dusk, that's when I'll switch back over to top water. And I find the same to be true oftentimes on our still water as well on the lake. Nothing's better than late summer largemouth bass fishing, throwing out like a master splinter pattern, a little mouse pattern or any other, topwater bug and bouncing it along the surface. And just, when it gets low light enough that you can't even see the fly, but you'll hear the take, then to set it. So that's how I do it. Now, Matt, I don't know if you have a different approach or kind of a mixture.
Yeah. I mean, like you guys said, it definitely depends on conditions, but all things being equal, if the river's good, it's decently clear and, average to maybe a little low water flow, like a lot of our summer days when we're out, smallmouth. I think it really depends on the density of your smallmouth population and what the water's doing. The New River, which one of the waters that I fish a lot for smallmouth, is dam controlled, and so the water goes up and it goes down on any given day. When the water's coming up, the fish are generally tighter to the banks. When it's coming down, they kind of scatter, and they can be more mid-river or off of the first or second shelves coming off the bank. And but generally, if you have scattered fish or you have fewer fish, your higher percentage option is going to be in something that you retrieve a fairly long distance. When you fish a topwater bug, at least the way I do it, I don't move them a ton, so it splats down and you're effectively fishing maybe like an 8-10 foot radius from where that bug splats down. And so if you have a bunch of fish that are scattered out the river and in no super specific or predictable place, then that is not necessarily your most effective approach. In that situation, I would be fishing a bait fish fly if the water's warm enough, and moving it a long distance to theoretically get in front of more fish and create more opportunities, versus, maybe you go out on the New one morning and the water's coming up. Those fish are going to be on the bank, so you don't necessarily have to fish a long distance. You can still fish a bait fish fly, or you can fish a topwater bug, but you're not going to have to move it quite as far. So a topwater bug works great. And if you have a lot of fish and that if you put a fly in good looking habitat and a good looking spot, there's probably a fish nearby. And yeah, topwater bug works great. And I've never, I don't necessarily adhere to like topwater in the morning and streamers during the day, and vice versa, or something like that. But generally whatever the sort of conditions and fish numbers dictate. And then also, if you do happen to have, even if you have a lot of fish in the river, in the summertime, ideally, the best days, in my opinion, are always high sun days, because what it does, particularly if you're fishing, the New is a deep river, so it's a little more complicated. It's like you said, Brian, when the sun comes up, they've either got to go deep or they've got to go into shade. And if you've got a shallow river and high sun, that's your best case scenario, because all the fish are going to be packed into shade. because they have nowhere else to go. And in that situation, a topwater bug works great. A streamer works great. The other difference, I guess, between a streamer and a topwater bug is if the fish are just being slow, you will be seeing fish and having positive reinforcement with the topwater bug generally, because the fish are going to be coming up to the surface, maybe pecking at your bug or taking it, not getting the hook or something like that. And so you might see a little more life that way versus if you're fishing a streamer, 3-4 feet down the water column, and the fish are being slow and they just follow your fly for a second or they nose up to it, you may not know. Topwater bugs are great for just strike detection and seeing fish in general, because it's pretty easy with a topwater bug. But those are sort of some general rules that I follow.
Cool. Yeah, we got time for about maybe 2 more questions. And I did want to, because I know that I've been asked this year, and it's a fair question, right? Again, strange year, people are trying to figure out how to fish. They're looking at waters. They're looking at, and this is true for, our smallmouth. It's been true for musky. It's even true for out on the coast. You may not necessarily, want to take out a regular boat, and people are looking to, other types of personal watercraft and kayaks especially, whether that be to get out on a lake or whether that be to float down a river system. And so, Jeff, to you, for kayak fishing, is there, for Virginia waters, just a good kind of overall length of kayak, and then how do you approach kayak fishing on kind of our waters, from whether it be more coastal regions or up into the Shenandoah or some of the other river systems that we have?
Yeah, I mean, kayak length is pretty easy to me. I like a 12-foot boat. There's a reason for that. A 12-foot boat is kind of that perfect mesh of the kayak world. A 14-foot boat, 14, 15-foot boat, they're awesome. They're big barges, but they only go straight. They don't like to turn. But they'll go straight super well, and you'll be able to cover a lot of distance. Turn around, go the other way, start going smaller, let's say 10 or 9 feet. If you're a small enough person to be able to fish in a 9-foot kayak, which I hate to say it, I no longer am, used to be. And they turn on a dime. But if you ever try to go straight any distance, they're horrible, because the fact that for every mile you cover in a straight line, you cover 1.25 miles worth of snaking back and forth through the water. So a 12-foot boat's kind of that, just happy medium. With boats, one thing I will say is I am a bit old school with my kayaks. I like to paddle my boats. I'm not a big pedal guy. There's a couple of reasons for that. The pedal boats, they're awesome along the coast. They're awesome in lakes. Anywhere that you've got water depth, they're great. I fish a lot of small rocky rivers. I fish even big rocky rivers. The Rivanna in Charlottesville is one of my favorites to kayak. How many rocks, everybody who's fished it, how many rocks are there that are 3 inches beneath the surface that in a kayak you just barely go over top of? I don't want anything hanging lower than the bottom of my boat. Take the other one that I fish a lot is actually the James River. And I've actually moved back to Richmond, back to my hometown. And the James River in the city of Richmond is very similar. It's like a gigantic Rivanna. It's a lot of really shallow rocks with some deep holes in there. So for the same reason, I don't want to have anything hanging low. I know Andy's probably spent more time in a kayak lately than I have. I spent many years in them and still have my boat. Just haven't been getting it out as much as I'd like. But with the boats, pretty simple. 12-foot boat. Every brand builds something in that range and builds a good boat these days. Pretty much you get it from a reputable brand. They're not a bad boat. It's kind of the question is, do you buy a Ford or a Chevy? Well, I like Fords over Chevys. Yet I drive a Dodge. So, but that sort of thing, like, it comes down to your, personal preference. And I know Andy's spent, like I said, probably spent more time in a kayak recently than I have, so I'll let him, kind of answer that also.
Yeah, so for me, I like fishing out of a slightly larger kayak. Like Jeff said, I definitely lose a little bit of maneuverability. But one thing that was really important to me in a fly fishing kayak is the ability to stand in it. Fly fishing from seated can be done, but especially on a kayak, unlike a raft where you're already up off the water, if you're sitting in a kayak, you're right there at water level. So, your casting is definitely a little limited from the seated position. Not only that too, but also in terms of spotting fish, standing up makes a huge difference. So I fish out of more of a 13-foot kayak, and then also a little bit wider. I think mine's like 36 inches wider, so it's enough to stand in. But you definitely lose some maneuverability. And if you have the luxury to have multiple boats, having one for river fishing, one for salt, one for lakes, then obviously change it up. But for me, the most important factor was being able to stand. And so that's why I like a little bit larger for a kayak. But,
when I got started, standing wasn't an option. When I started, I remember the first boat that they marketed as a boat you could stand in was the Native Ultimate, which is kind of a hybrid canoe kayak thing. I remember that was a whole game changer for all of us. So a lot of the boats, 12-foot boat, a lot of the 12-foot boats you can't stand in, they're not the world's most stable things. I, more than once in my life, for absolutely no reason, have, as I tell people, randomly decided to meet the water. It happens, but it's part of it. So that's the reason why I do a lot more sitting. I think is also my boat wasn't ever intended to be stood in, or wasn't stood in as much as what I have in the past.
Yeah. So thank you. And the last question I think that I want to hit tonight is really, again, staying on the gear side of things. A lot of our participants, usually the first rod that they're going to get outfitted with is going to be a 5-weight. And I know I've had a lot of people kind of come to me and say, oh, I can't fish for bass, I only have a trout rod. Looking at that 5-weight for it. And so, obviously, this is really a two-parters. One, I think one that we'll all kind of agree upon. The best rod to use is the one that you have. It's you can make. I've personally caught bass on everything from a Tenkara rod and 2-weight rods all the way up to 10 weights. Whether or not I needed that 10-weight rod for the particular size of bass I caught on is a different story. But it's not you shouldn't look at that as a limiting factor. But the other part is, it is a fair question. If I'm going to be targeting smallmouth or largemouth, is there a rod that is preferable in its weight? If I am going to use, my Healing Waters 5-weight rod, what considerations do I have? Can I do every type of fishing that we've talked about today, or no, you really can't? I'll answer it first. I think, for me, I've always gravitated towards a 6 or a 7-weight rod, just a little bit heavier than those 5 weights. But I started fishing on a 4-weight, and I had no problems on a 4-weight targeting bass, and that included topwater, that included subsurface flies. I may have had to open up my cast a little bit, something called a Belgian cast, in order, to get out those heavier weighted flies when I'm, kind of undergunned, let's say, on a 4-weight rod or 5-weight. But it's still something I get that fly out. And, for me, as long as I can get that fly out consistently to maybe 40 feet, I can catch fish almost anywhere across the state. So it's not something that I have to worry about ripping off an 80, 100-foot cast. But that's my thoughts on it. And again, that's that perspective of coming into this, as a beginner only a few years ago. I'm curious about your all's thoughts as well, for people, especially if they may not be looking at, a quiver of a dozen different rod weights. What is a good overall, and what are ways that you can make a lighter weight rod work for our fishing?
I mean, I guess I'll go. Knowing the 5-weight rods that Healing Waters hands out, they're good little rods. You can do a lot with them. Brian's right. You can go target bass with them. I will say you might not be able to throw everything that we like to throw or throw it easily, but there is nothing wrong, and I mentioned it earlier, with taking a size 2 or a size 4 woolly bugger and tossing it. We've talked about bait fish, and I think when we talk about bait fish, I think all 4 of us are talking about the CK bait fish, just because we all do love that fly. At least I know I do. I'm tempted to get a tattoo of it. I mean, I love it that much. But, big woolly bugger can be thrown on a 5-weight without a problem. You can throw a tungsten-headed bugger on a 5-weight without a problem. Do I want to go throw a musky fly on a 5-weight? Yeah, I'm going to tell you no. That's not something that I would ever do. Nope, not even close. I like my 11-weight for that. It just makes my life a whole lot easier. And but I also say, if you're going musky fishing, if you're going out with a guide, just use the guide's rod. You don't have to, unless you've got a rod for it, just don't go buy one for that. If you're going out by yourself, okay, yeah, you might have to get a rod. But for me, the 5-weight's a great rod. My preferred rod for most of my fishing is a 7-weight. I have a 7-weight that I currently call my Visa because I never leave home without it. So, it is my favorite rod to cast. It casts well. It goes pretty much everywhere with me. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I want to go to you next, Matt, and then kind of end on you, Andy, since you probably get asked this question more than anyone. So what are your thoughts around it, Matt?
Yeah, and like you said, Brian, I mean, the first rod that I ever had was a 3-weight, and I grew up on the Rivanna River in Fluvanna County, and smallmouth fish, every day in the summertime as a kid, and it worked for me. Most back then I was throwing stuff like woolly buggers and foam-legged things that I tied by myself, and all the way up to clousers and heavy dumbbell-eyed flies, and like you said again, Brian, I mean, it's you make it work. You figure out how to get it out there and fish it. And a 5-weight is great for I mean, you can do pretty much any kind of trout fishing with it. I used to throw big streamers on my 4-weight until I got beat up by a couple of really big fish and used some heavier rods that I had, but it works. And the one thing I would say is don't, if you are going to use a rod that is lighter than what you would prefer to use for a given application, say you're going smallmouth fishing, you've got a 5-weight, just make sure all your other tackle is up to par. Don't take your 5-weight with a 4X leader and go smallmouth fishing, because you're going to have to fight fish for a long time, and or you're going to break a lot of fish off. Use what you would on a 7-weight or a 6-weight or an 8-weight. And then just sort of, also just the more you fish, the more you learn how to use a rod, to your advantage. What parts of the rod do different things. The butt section of a rod puts pressure on fish. The tip section protects your tippet and keeps you from breaking fish off. And the more you learn about that, the more you can do pretty much anything with any rod. So that's all I would say.
Yeah, and then Andy, like I said, you probably get asked this more than any of us. Jeff, you may still have been asked more than this than Andy overall in your lifetime, but curious about your thoughts, and your perspective on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd basically echo everything y'all say as far as getting on the water and making what you have work for your situation. Like you all said, throw flies that are appropriate for the gear you're using. Don't frustrate yourself trying to throw stuff too heavy or too big. That's just going to lead to problems. And then I would say start with that 5-weight and go out and fish. And especially if you don't know for sure where you're going to spend most of your time, explore with the 5-weight and figure it out. And if you find out, hey, I really love brook trout fishing and this is what I'm going to do a lot of, then go and invest in a 3-weight. And if you find out you love smallmouth fishing and, you're going to maybe trout fish here and there, keep your 5-weight for that and go and get a 6, 7, or 8-weight. If you already have the 5, I'd say probably jump at least up to the 7. But figure out what you're going to do the most of. And then if you're not going to buy a bunch of different rods, get 2 that will work for what you do the best. So.
No, yeah, thanks. And, really appreciate you guys. Before we officially wrap up, I know we did have a question about any Healing Waters group trips coming up soon. And so, I will talk a little bit about that. And obviously, nobody expected 2020 to be the way that it has been. And when we shut down, 16, 17 weeks ago, because, our channel here, our program, we went live almost within that first week that Healing Waters made the decision to close down in-person meetings. We it's an ever-evolving situation. It's one that this is a statement being made on the 30th of June and is subject to change. Right now, we are actively reviewing and keeping track of what's going on, not just in the Virginia region, but across the entire nation and to some extent the entire world. Project Healing Waters has over 230 programs nationwide, and there are some events that occur overseas as well, and many events sadly have been postponed. And, we're still trying to figure out when to bring those in, to include things like the Mossy Creek Invitational, Legends of the Fly. Those events, we're actively trying to figure out what can be done. As far as the local program here in Charlottesville, again, we are not starting any in-person meetings as of yet. We are hoping, and I'm going to caveat this with a hope of being able to do a couple outdoor outings this year, but we don't have specific timelines on that yet. And as soon as we can, we will. It's something that all of us desperately want to do, to get back out, to get together, to come together as a group, and to see one another and to be able to fish again. But it's not something that has been made as a decision from Project Healing Waters as the organization. Now, I will say that, and that was kind of the point of tonight, just because we're not doing things in Healing Waters from an official capacity, it doesn't mean you can't get out and fish. We know many people within our group have been fishing. Hopefully tonight you may have been inspired by a couple of ideas about ways that you could go fishing. And there are some very safe ways to do it. If you're an individual like myself who is quarantined from social interaction until there is a vaccine, as an asthmatic, as a high-risk individual, I have been out and gone fishing on the river, here in Charlottesville, because the Rivanna has plenty of spots where you can do that safely. I've gone out on lakes, I've gone out on Beaver Creek Reservoir as an example, because it's something that, I'm fortunate enough, I have a boat, I can get out, and that maintains that social distancing. Is very safe to do so. So I would say, fish at your comfort level. If you feel comfortable going out, certainly don't do anything that you are uncomfortable with. That's something that I think we all can do. But unfortunately, from an official Project Healing Waters perspective, I don't have any dates yet that I can share when we're going to start. But I do promise that the moment we know when we can do some outings, we'll get that information out, and we'll organize it. And for those of you watching from other areas other than just Charlottesville, one, thank you for joining us. But I would encourage you to talk to your local assistant program leads and program leads within your local organization. And, it's something that all of us want to stay in touch. We're more than happy to. And really any of us on here as well. I'm going to throw Matt under the bus included. If you have questions, I know Matt's very active on Facebook. And he has a website as well that you can get in touch with him. Obviously, Jeff and I, we're still going to continue to do these live streams. I do have an update for that at the very end of this. And then Andy with Mossy Creek Fly Fishing. I know I've called up them multiple times, just like, what can I fish for this weekend? And they'll go through and they'll tell me. So we're all here to help, and to try to make sure that everyone can still get out and have some fun during these times. So the last update before we wrap it up with our guest is we are going to be moving to the second and fourth Tuesdays only for at least maybe the remainder of the summer, or at least the next month or two. We have a couple different reasons why we need to move to that format. So we won't be doing every week. It'll be every other Tuesday. However, for those of you in the Charlottesville region, look for an email. Almost every night of the week, I say almost because I think weekends are semi-excluded. There is a virtual event going on throughout the country. Many here in the Virginia region, but also, as an example, our friends out in St. Cloud with All Tied Up, they're doing lots of live streams throughout the week as well. So, even though we may not be doing a live stream every Tuesday, there is something going on that you're more than encouraged and welcome to join. Just like we have many that will join us here within our Charlottesville live streams from outside of our program. And the last thing is I know a lot of people at home, we can't hear you, but all of us thank our guests for joining us today. Matt, thank you very, very much. Andy, always thank you for joining us, and Jeff, you as well. Really appreciate you coming in, sharing your expertise with us, giving us some ideas on ways that we can improve our fishing and be able to fish during these times. So thank you very much, and have a great night.
Yeah.
Have a good one, everyone.